Okay. Going. Good. We're going to do sum up without taking a break. Ask the panelists from distal to proximal to sum up, and then we'll declare victory.
I guess the question, go back to the original question that we were asked to address. I'll pick one of the questions. Under what conditions can we trust inference from observational or naturalistic comparison? Am I looking at the right questions? No. Next page. Random assignment is always preferable, but when is the cost in time, money, infrastructure, patient exposure truly necessary? And I think we are concluding, or we're on the same page, in that randomization is an incredibly important tool that can provide very high quality answers to important questions. But there are situations when we can't randomize. I think there are many such situations, maybe there will be fewer going forward, when we must use observational data and observational studies, and so therefore we just have to keep improving the way we do these studies.
I'm still reeling from the thought of Dr. Temple talking with his pharmaceutical benefits manager about access to the drug that he approved. But
we should hear from his health plan representative.
Having gotten through that, I mean, if I put together the whole day, what I would say is that we ought to the real world data part. I think we got a good basis now for creating a set of criteria that would enable people, and we need to make real world data better regardless of whether we randomize. And then I think not randomizing, I think the advance now is that we're getting closer to a set of criteria that Sebastian and others put forward, where if you choose not to randomize and to do treatment inference, you'd better do these things. And if you can't show that you've done them, you should be drummed out of the business, basically, and journals shouldn't publish it. And I think that'll be tremendous progress. I still say we ought to do more randomization, not less, but recognize that there are hundreds of situations where you can't, and the more automation we can do with the criteria that Sebastian laid out, I think the smarter we'll get. Just one quick plug on, while I have the floor, on the data part. You know, I'm so excited, Rich, that you're helping to put together the data janitors meeting at the ICPE meeting this year. So the real recognition that getting the data right, you know, everything's secondary to that. If we don't do that, we're not going to make progress, whether we randomize or not.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by saying that Rory gave a really dynamic viewpoint, which Greg mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, and he told us he'd worked it all out in 1984. So I had a nice conversation with him afterwards, and he gave me his paper from 1984, which is the year the Macintosh computer came out. So maybe that's the beginning of big data. But it was interesting because in the paper he said, well, you know, if there's an intervention that has a large effect, then this effect could be identified more or less reliably by clinical observation or historically controlled comparisons, and whether or not randomized trials were desirable. And so that was interesting because we had Rory had inadvertently put himself on record that there may be some space for that. And then what was interesting was just because, you know, the data, we didn't have sort of big data in 1984 that was readily accessible for healthcare data. They were really trying to grasp some of the same problems. They were struggling with some of the same problems, and they had slightly different solutions. So there were concerns about random variation in the samples that were used in clinical trials and differing trial basically effect estimates that were fairly divergent, and so the proposal there was sort of the early days of meta-analysis. And the other thing that was kind of interesting in this paper was you know, that the whole concept of large simple trials was sort of proposed back in the early 80s as a real-world data-like approach to dealing with some of these issues. And there was another interesting corollary in the paper, which was, you know, the effects of treatment on major endpoints, such as stroke, are going to sort of be easier to operationalize in large, simple trials. And I think the corollary is now true sort of in the big data environment. It's easier to we've heard that today, it's easier to operationalize those kinds of outcomes in claims or EHR. So it's, it's just good to remember that maybe the tools are changing, but some of the underlying issues have actually been there for a long time. I think that leads to, as far as, the FDA's approach and the evaluation over the next several years, like it's going to be very broad-based. It's going to include randomization, randomized designs, pragmatic trials, whatever you want to call it. It's also going to range into looking at observational as well. And I think, again, the one slide that was worth pointing out with Sebastian was the one where he had all the kind of the, the sort of Cochrane collaboration, like, can you do observational or not, and sort of the big diamond and the blobs on either side according to different therapeutic areas. So I think that bears repeating. I think we don't expect that there's going to be one answer, uniform, sort of up or down for a role of observational. This is going to depend on the particular intersection of therapeutic area and the outcomes that you'd like to assess, the effectiveness, what zone of therapeutic area and outcomes are you really looking at. But I think, there are some principles that are, beginning to at least be things to look at. And one we've already talked about extensively is you kind of can't get anywhere if you don't have the appropriate data available. So you have to think about your data needs and what data needs will allow you to give you sort of a clinically important effect that you want to measure. And then you have to think about trial design. If you were planning an RCT and you want to operationalize it in real-world data, you may have more concerns with a non-inferiority design than a superiority design. And it can be, as Sebastian said, more difficult to deal with a need for a placebo group versus maybe a need not for a pure placebo group like Bob Temple was talking about, where maybe you're just adding the fourth drug. So there are things that are starting to come out. And then also this whole concept of, we're quantitatively looking at like how balanced are these populations that you want to compare, particularly when you don't have randomization. If they're highly imbalanced and there's no propensity score overlap, maybe you shouldn't be doing the study you're planning to do. Or conversely, on the back end, if they overlapped enough, but you want to look for what the unmeasured confounding might be, then there need to be some sort of semi-quantitative methods there. So I think the message is there's a lot to think about. It's nice that we're moving from just sort of posturing or talking past each other and really trying to get into the details and really work a lot of examples over the next several years to hopefully help us learn more and be able to act on it.
Right, so on an operational level, it helps me to differentiate the when to get by without randomization from the how to do these studies, right? Keep those two things slightly separate. And on the how-to side, we have learned a lot over the last 20 years, right? We have, I think we understand very well how to do good studies, right? And how to avoid avoidable design flaws, right? It is the when-to, which largely is driven by the underlying data. Are the data fit for answering that question, right? And we as academics, right, we are usually not in the driver's seat of generating data. We are using data that other people have generated. At least don't like to talk about is what I cannot influence, right? I sometimes describe myself as a truffle hog because I'm sniffing around globally trying to find the right data set that fits the study question, right? And then it's gold when you find that, right? But usually there is no one single data set that will be fit for all the different questions that you have. So the when-to, in my mind, is largely driven by the underlying data source that you have available, which again is why I'm so excited about all these new developments about generating more data and linking them together, right? So, thank you.
Okay, so 7 or 8 years ago, Janet Woodcock said, the trouble with pharmacoepidemiologists, or maybe she said the trouble with you pharmacoepidemiologists, is that you're a guild. No matter what the question is, you say, we'll take it under advisement and tell you what the answer is. And I think we're in a fundamentally different place now, both with regard to the evolution of data and sort of a growing appreciation of what good rules of practice are. I'd say in addition to everything else that this august group has said, it's actually, I think at the end of the day, not only better, but substantially cheaper. The example that Adrian described this morning of the study that Alan Goh did comparing dabigatran to warfarin used custom programming because that's all that was available, and it took a long time to do, and it was expensive. The Sentinel tools can now fully reproduce that study without writing a single line of new code. Now, it's a complicated program, and it has lots of parameters that need to be set, and so it's not all that straightforward to use. But we're now in a position where I think we can say we can do better, clearly reproducible studies using tools that that can be extensively vetted at much faster and at much lower cost than the old-fashioned way. So I'd say it's a promising world we live in with regard to this question of when we decide we don't have to randomize, how can we deal with that? So I'm going to call end to this session. Greg, you're going to tell us what happens next and when we regroup, and any homework assignments for tonight?
So we will be regrouping tomorrow morning. Breakfast is available at 8:30. We'll convene ourselves at 9. Our goal for tomorrow is to try to pull together what happened today. So what I'm hoping we'll do is have actually pretty much a working session, and we will try to go back through these sessions we talked about to say, can we write some things down? Of the things we write down, can we say which of these things do we have broad agreement, which of these things do we have partial agreement about? So the homework is, I hope all of you will think about that and come tomorrow prepared to make your specific suggestions. I think we've seen in each of these sessions some first steps toward that, but our goal, as we said about at the beginning, is to leave here with something much more specific to answer to that "it depends" question. I'm not expecting all will be nailed down, but I'm hoping we'll leave here tomorrow a lot further along than we were when we started this morning. So thanks a lot.